What we know will happen later on today is that MPs will debate and then vote on a piece of legislation that essentially would prevent Prime Minister Boris Johnson, or whoever ends up being Prime Minister in theory, from departing the EU at the end of October without some kind of negotiated agreement. Now, that's something that he said he would like to hold on to as an option for his negotiating position, as you just heard from him there. But it looks likely at this stage that he will also himself, through his government, try and table a separate effort to try and seek an election. It's not that straightforward anymore, though, because he doesn't have a majority in the parliament. He now has to try and work with opposition lawmakers in some sense to get them to approve the idea of an election. You actually need a two-thirds majority in order to demand an election at this point. And so going into this very, very complex period in mid-October, where you have that European Council summit he just referenced as well in his speech, what we could see is an election just days before that, and potentially a new Prime Minister travelling to Brussels. To try and make sense of all of this and put it in context, I'm joined by Andrew Adonis. He's a member of the House of Lords here in Westminster. And what's interesting this week, because we have the suspension of Parliament just a few days away early next week, people in here racing yesterday to try and put this legislation through that would allow them to block no deal. That legislation will have to go to the House of Lords where you sit, and that will have to get passed relatively quickly. Do you think it's going to happen?
Well, we're going to spend the next 3 days debating it, and it'll be almost continuous debates, and the House of Lords is normally very sedate because we're supposed to be the reflective chamber, but I can assure you passions are running extremely high. But it will go through, because the rule of our constitution is that what the House of Commons wants, within reason, it can get the House of Lords as a kind of constitutional long stop, and the overwhelming majority of the members of the House of Lords don't want to see a disorderly Brexit. They're actually they passionately are with the majority of MPs who are deeply worried that Boris Johnson is taking the country to the edge of a cliff and we've got to pull back. So the bill will go through the Lords. The question is what Boris Johnson now does, because his move to have an election is certainly going to be stopped this week, because, as you said, it requires the consent of two-thirds of the members of the House of Commons, and he's not going to get close to that. And there will not be any consent to an early election until a no-deal Brexit is dead and buried. Indeed, let's be clear, what's actually happening is that the majority of members of Parliament are now steadily moving against Brexit in all its forms. And so how this is resolved, whether there is an early election, there's a very low level of trust in Parliament at the moment with Boris Johnson, who was the choice of a minority now in the House of Commons, and I think we're in for a deep and ongoing political crisis.
The challenge, presumably, for the opposition, that's the Labour Party, the Lib Dems and others, is to try and have an election to resolve the situation in the long term, because there is no stable majority. We've seen that over the last 10, 11 months, and yet to do it on their terms. So from your understanding, and for viewers around the world watching this, very confused, no doubt, by what's going on, how is it possible for them to dictate the timings of an election, given that we're getting closer and closer to this October 31st deadline that everyone is so nervous about?
Well, to be frank, there's no one single guiding mind at the moment, as you could probably gather. We're in a very confused situation. But the two things which have been constantly to the fore in this whole Brexit crisis is that there is a responsible majority in Parliament that is not prepared to see a kind of ideologically driven, hard Brexit, a wing and a prayer, we're going to get all these great trade deals around the world even though they don't exist and all of that, and is constantly pulling back from attempts to take Britain into a Brexit which is on a wing and a prayer, all promise, no delivery. That's first thing. The second thing is that there's a determination not to have another election and trying to return to a new political regime until we've dealt with this Brexit crisis. And the way I think that's going to be resolved is that we have to take the decisions now about what's actually going to happen to Brexit. And though people talk about an extension of the negotiating period, let's be clear, if the negotiating period is extended again, I think it's very hard to see that Brexit survives that. And I think what will happen is once that is resolved, which looks like another 2 to 3 month deep crisis, once that's resolved, then I think there will be an election and we'll be into what I hope is the post-Brexit world in the sense of Brexit not having happened. It may be it's a post-Brexit world in the sense of Brexit actually having happened, and that I think would be an ongoing crisis if that happens, because then we're into endless negotiations over trade deals, over Northern Ireland borders and all of that. But there seems to be a kind of inchoate but growing determination on the part of parliamentarians to try and deal with and preferably end Brexit over the next 2 to 3 months, and then move on to what we hope will be politics as normal.
Hey everybody, it's Hadley Gamble from our new CNBC Middle East Bureau in Abu Dhabi. Thanks for stopping by. Now to watch more, you can try one of the videos that just popped up on your screen. And don't forget to subscribe.